Here are some cool things you can do with text in GiMP. First, we're going to need a nice background. Here's a background. Now it's going to be pretty boring unless we add some text. This is the text we're starting with. Now let's rotate it. That was easy enough. How about some better colors?
Hold up. Wait a minute.
On second thoughts, I want a lighter background. Here are the fancy colors I promised. Let's add a nice border. That's the border added. Now let's make it 3D. Very nice. And for the last effect, we're going to add a drop shadow. Here's the final text with a drop shadow added. Now, onto how it's done. So, step 1 for these 5 effects in GiMP, we want to recreate the background. So, let's go up to File and create a new template. And we'll just do 1920 by 1080. Okay, since our background was set to yellow, we've got just a plain yellow background. It looks pretty horrible, but anyway, we're going to go in and put in some guides. We go to Image, Guides by percent, and have that on vertical and 50%. That'll give us the vertical line, and we'll go back to Image, Guides by percent, and now let's do the horizontal line. This just shows us where the center is. Now we need to choose our colors. I'm pretty sure I had a green and a light blue. And to make this this sort of color gradient, we use the gradient tool. We make sure our gradient tool is on radial. And the reason why we have our guides is we can just go to the center and drag outwards. Now that is looking approximately like what we had there. Beautiful. Now with our guides still up, we're going to add the text. So we come over to our text tool here, and we're going to add each piece of text separately. So we'll drag one box and write better, and the second box for text, and one lower box for effects. Now we want to make, the reason why we have different boxes for each text is because I want to make the bottom much bigger. I'm going to go 165 for that. Drag it out so we can see the S. We want to make text a bit smaller, about 90. And better, we can probably have a little bit bigger, let's say 125, see if that works. Okay, now we go to our Move tool to bring it all together to the positions that we want. We'll have effects in the middle. Bring it up a bit. And go to Better. We'll bring that in line with the effects. And move text just in line as well. How does that look? That's about what we had before. Okay, so on to the first effect, which is rotate. Rotate's very simple. You just come over to the rotate tool here. But before we do that, we want to link each piece of text. So when we rotate one piece of text, all others will follow with it. So what we're going to do first here is in this section here, we're going to right click, and we want to create a new layer group. Double click on that, and we'll call this the text group. So in the text group, we can put each piece of text. There we go. And now we're going to put on the chain symbol, which links all of these together. So now when we go into the rotate tool, effects, and we're going to type in -10 degrees, that's going to rotate. And once we click rotate, all other pieces of text will rotate with it. Perfect. Now we can go on to effect 2, which is the adding a color gradient to the text itself. So the colors I had were a red and a yellow. So first, what we want to do is we want to highlight each piece of text, and we want to highlight the borders of them. So what we're going to do is we're going to shift click, alt click on each piece of text, and then hold shift down to select each other piece of text when you click on it, just like so. Now we want to go into paths, and we want to go to selection to path. What this is going to do is it's going to save this selection that we've made of the path around each of the texts. And the reason why we make a selection is A, for later, and later we can use this selection without going through and selecting each piece. And also it can help to smoothen out this selection that we made. So what we can do is hit Control Shift A to deselect, and then we're just going to reselect it with path to selection, and that can sometimes clear up any jagged edges that you get. So we go back to layers, and here we want to create a new layer. This new layer we're going to call text gradient, because we're going to use the gradient tool with our colors, and make sure it has transparency. Beautiful. Now we want to move this this gradient outside of the text group before we start putting the gradient on. So we're going to move it up one actually, and we're going to minimize this text group so we don't see it. Take that out actually. Yep, and just there. So now we come back to our gradient tool and choose our colors. We wanted red for the foreground and the yellow for the background. Gradient tool, and again using our guide, we can just, 1 second, we actually need to move that up a bit. Yeah, there we go. So again with our guide, we can drag this out and get the color that we want. Let's say about there. That's about what we had. Okay. We can again go Control Shift A and deselect our selection. We don't need our guides anymore, so we'll go to Images, Image, Guides, and remove all guides. And so that's the text that we have so far. Now, moving on to our third effect, which is called a stroke effect, essentially adding a border of some sort of color around the outside of your text. So the way we're going to do this is first we're going to again create a new layer. We're going to name this one stroke. And again, we want it filled with transparency. So there we have our new layer. And again, we're going to go back to our Paths tab, and we're going to reuse this selection that we had before of the text. So making sure in layers that we have selected the stroke. Go to Paths. So we want to go down and reselect using path to selection. That selects it. And now we want to go to paint along the path. This brings up the stroke tool. We want a solid color line, anti-aliasing, and we'll have the line width at 6 pixels. And so we hit stroke, and that gives us the stroke. Control Shift A to deselect. We want this to be a little bit thicker around the outside, so we go back into it. Sometimes it can, sometimes the pixels don't show up quite right, so I went in and changed it to 8. I'm just going to hit Control Z again, go in, put it back down to 6. There we go. That is the thickness that we want. So there, that is the stroke effect. Now, onto the fourth effect, we want to add a long shadow, which adds that 3D effect to the writing. So to create the long shadow, we want to go back to layers and we want to copy the gradient text layer. So click on this one, right click, and we want to go to duplicate layer. We're going to drag that one just below the text gradient, double click on this, and you can rename it to long and shadow. Okay, so the long shadow is actually quite easy to implement. Once you've made the new layer, make sure you click on long shadow, and then we go to filters, light and shadow, and long shadow. Once you're in the long shadow toolbar, there's plenty of options you can play with. You have the angle at which the shadow is at. You can have the style. At the moment it is on finite. You can go to infinite, which goes off the page. Fading, which gives that effect. And you can do fading fixed length, which is also quite a nice effect. For this one, I'll just go with finite. I'm not going to change the angle. I do want the length a lot shorter, so we'll go to about there, maybe 50. Bit shorter. Do 40. And that should do. You can fiddle with the opacity as well, but we won't for this one, and we'll just click OK. And that is the long shadow. Finally, we want to add a drop shadow, which is our fifth effect, and that gives it the sort of glow of any color you want. For our case, we'll probably use black, and that just gives it a darker background so these lighter colors stand out. So for that, what we want to do is we want to go back to layers and we want to duplicate the long shadow. So click on long shadow and then right click and duplicate layer. Come down and bring it below the long shadow, double click to rename, and we'll do drop shadow. And again, to do this, make sure we are clicked onto drop shadow. We'll come into filters, light and shadow again, and right next to long shadow, we have drop shadow. So for the drop shadow, we can change both in the X and Y direction how much shadow we have, like so. I'm going to bring it was at 20, I'm going to bring it up a little bit higher. We have blur radius. This is the amount, the radius outwards that it blurs. If you can have a lot of blur, we don't want that. We can have no blur, which is essentially an extension of a long shadow. So we want some blur, say around about there. Glow radius, you don't need to mess around with too much. And of course you have opacity. I'm going to move that one up a little bit because I want it a bit darker. And that is pretty much how we had the original text. Obviously the colors are slightly different from each one, but there are the 5 effects for text in GiMP. Hope you enjoyed the video and see you in the next one.